Welcome to week 3 of course 4 in the certificate course in apologetics. Again, while the premise of this course is to help you learn to include the method of presenting truth using apologetics, before you can defend any truth, you have to have a reasonable understanding of truth. I know you already have a good understanding of the sequence of events in the Bible, but my task with this course is to present information more consistent with questions people have to help you to be in position to answer them. Again, as I said with the first class, no one needs to be a scholar to use apologetics. The whole method is to be engaged in the process of discovery with the individual seeking to know truth. This means there will be topics, issues, history, or more that you do not know, which you will need to learn while assisting others in the pursuit of truth. There is nothing more refreshing than an instructor or a leader who is humble and presents themselves in an equal manner to the people that they are assisting. I certainly have learned a great deal in the development of this course, which is a major benefit to being a teacher. As you lead others into the proper understanding of truth, I trust you too will realize the personal benefit you derive. The history of the nations from Abraham forward is still developing in our day. We won't know the whole story until the end, when Christ returns and the evil that has impaired all creation is judged and God deals with all sources of evil in all finality. However, God clearly wants His people to have understanding of history. God also wants us to have some understanding about the future. For these reasons, God has given us His written word, the Bible, to provide us with history and with future prophecies so we can better discern our present realities. Last week, we considered how the nations of the world, first formally established by God from Noah's descendants, are really people groups with common interests, abilities, and more. Because of the efforts of men with the Tower of Babel, God confounded their language and scattered them widely over the face of the earth, giving them over to their own desires to serve gods other than the one true God. Even though God disinherited these people, that does not mean God's love for them was withdrawn. No, just as we read in the New Testament, by giving people over to their own desires, there is a very real possibility they will become disenchanted with their debased reality and choose to repent and be restored to God. Also, by scattering the people all over the face of the earth, God demonstrated He is sovereign over all, and He will ultimately accomplish what He intends, regardless of any interference from the spiritual or human beings who reject Him. Transforming the whole earth into a place like the original Garden of Eden has and always will be God's goal. According to Genesis chapter 11, after God divides the nations among the sons of God, who are evil spiritual beings, God declares Israel His own portion. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. And He calls Abram, whose name was later changed to Abraham. Just as God immediately pronounced a remedy for Adam and Eve's rejection of God in the Garden of Eden by way of the promised Redeemer, so did God immediately disclose the continuation of the remedy upon disinheriting the people in Genesis chapter 10 and 11. We see through the lineage of Seth, God continued His plan for all humanity. From Seth's lines comes Abraham, whom God made a covenant with, branding Abraham as the father of many nations, more specifically, many nations of people who will choose God as their governance. Scriptures reveal from Abraham, Isaac was born, and from Isaac, Jacob was born, and Jacob's name was later changed to Israel. Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, and from one of the tribes, the tribe of Levi, Moses was born. Moses was a type and a foreshadow of the promised Messiah, Jesus the Christ. From the same lineage came King David, who was a type of Christ as king, and Jesus, or the Messiah Himself, came from the lineage of Abraham. This is a fast-forward explanation leading up to Christ, but we need to have some understanding of the many twists and turns evil enemies of God continue to inflict in attempt to prevent God's plan from being fulfilled. Remember, the evil we experience on earth originated with the fallen angels led by Lucifer, whose name was changed to Satan. Thanks to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Messiah, Satan and his followers are already defeated. God's final judgment and doom has been pronounced for a time in the future. Until then, we need understanding of the unrelenting efforts of Satan and his minions and how God uses every bit of their evil to bring good. As you know, Abraham's original name was Abram. He was said to have been born in about 2018 BC, around 352 years after the flood. Abram was the 10th generation from Noah. This fact, being the 10th generation, is significant. The number 10 in the Hebrew culture is the number of God's authority, of completeness, holiness, perfection, and divine order. The original meaning of 10 was union or connection. Abram was born in Ur, a city south of Babylonia, but for the most part of his life, he traveled as a nomad in the region of the present-day Israel. Abram's father moved the family from Ur to Haran, which was on the way to Canaan. God called Abraham when he was 75 years old. We read this in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 2. The Lord spoke to Abram, saying, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now I'd like you to make note here, even the evil people of the world will be blessed by Abram's offsprings. This promise was the beginning of God's special relationship with Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel. It has found its ultimate in Jesus Christ, again a descendant of Abraham, and the ultimate blessing for all the nations of the world. Please recall that I shared in previous lessons about Jesus being the desire of all nations. So Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and departed Haran, traveling to Canaan, specifically to Shechem, to the oak of Moriah. At this time, the Canaanites were in the land. Genesis 12:7 reveals the Lord appeared to Abram and said, quote, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram built an altar to the Lord in that place. Shechem is the modern-day Tel Bablatah, which is the West Bank, also known as Samaria. From Shechem, Abram migrates southward to the location between Ai, and Bethel, where he built an altar. Following, a severe famine in Canaan forces Abram to seek refuge in Egypt. Because of the Nile River, the land was better suited for food and water for both Abram's clan and their livestock. Genesis 13 explains Abram and Lot eventually left Egypt and returned to Negeb, which is the southern region of Canaan. This is when Lot and Abram separate. Lot chose the Jordan Valley, which was east, while Abram settled in the land of Canaan. In Genesis chapter 13, verse 14, again the Lord spoke to Abram, saying, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all of the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." End quote. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, let me interject here. Every place God makes a promise to Abram, Abram builds an altar. To me, that means it's the same as staking out the territory. Also, God says as far as Abram can see, north, south, east, and west is the land God will give him to be his land and his offspring's forever. So the claims for the land by anyone other than the Israelites are not recognized by God. In God's eyes, the Jews do not occupy the land, they own it. If I buy a house but wait years to move into it, the house is still mine without question. This helps us consider ownership of the land from God's perspective. All the earth is God's, and he gives what he wills to whom he chooses. Chapter 14 is the famous story where Abram rescues Lot, and chapter 15 is when God further seals his promise to Abram with a covenant. Genesis 15 verse 1 reveals God came to Abram in a vision, stating, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." In response, Abram inquired of the Lord, because at this point he still was childless and wondered if Eleazar of Damascus, who was a member of Abram's household, would be his heir. Verse 4 states, "The word of the Lord then replied, stating, This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. So shall your offspring be. I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur to the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." Then, to confirm to Abram God's promise would not be hindered, God instituted the ritual of the covenant, which we read about in Genesis chapter 15, verses 9 to 20. During this ritual, in verse 13, God said, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." God unconditionally pledges that Abram's offspring will possess this land. The reference to his offspring and the land links this covenant with the earlier conditional promise that Abraham would become a great nation, Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. The condition of the first promise was for Abram to go, leave his father's house, which Abram honored. The land was clearly identified by God in Genesis chapter 15, 18 to 20, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. Then in Genesis 18 through chapter 20, God also reveals the land was occupied by various people groups, all of which were descendants of Canaan, whose father was Ham, whom God had disinherited. The 10 nations listed here were those that continued to reject God. Yet God revealed his plan was for the descendants of Abram to dispose these people after the 4th generation, once the sin of the Amorites is full. Now, the Amorites were one of the main population groups in Canaan, frequently listed with the Canaanites and others. God's comments implies the Amorites will be dispossessed of their land as an act of divine punishment. At that time, their accumulated inequity will be so great that God will no longer tolerate their presence in the land. In Genesis 16, we learn of Sarai's efforts to help God's promise be fulfilled as she convinces Abram to take her Egyptian maidservant as his wife, so Abraham could have an heir. To me, this is significant for a few reasons, and this is my independent thinking. First, this speaks of a lack of faith in God on both Sarai's and Abram's part, and reveals the human tendency to want to help God while justifying our actions in the process. According to extra-biblical ancient texts, the custom of producing an heir through a maidservant was practiced in Near East cultures. And up to this point, God had not specifically told his people, not to intermarry. That didn't happen until the time of Moses. Also, God has not specifically said the child of promise would come from Sarai. He only said it would be Abram's own son, Genesis 15:4. Perhaps these considerations allowed them to justify their decision and actions. However, the fact Abram listened and agreed to his wife's scheme instead of inquiring of God is suspect. And knowing Hagar, the maidservant, was from the lineage of Ham, one of the nations of God's people who were disinherited, makes their decision even more suspect. It seems their knowledge of God's separation of the nations would have, or at least should have, alerted Abram that having sexual union with Haggai would be inconsistent with God's revealed plans. Again, this is my independent thinking. And as we know from this union, Abram and Hagar bore Ishmael, part from the lineage of Seth and part from that of Ham. Scriptures reveal Abram's faith was tested at least 12 times, and some were not what we'd consider big tests, but together they established a picture of Abraham as a person whose faith was genuine, albeit not perfect. The story of Abram's union with Hagar is considered his first or fifth test. Like us, Abram was repeatedly tested, and like us, Abraham did not always pass the test. Yet, all the tests together establish a picture of Abram as a person whose faith was genuine, albeit not perfect. While it does not appear God directly corrected or punished Abram, he did allow Abram to suffer the consequence of his actions, just as he did the people of the Tower of Babel, and he does with all people to this very day. There is a parallel of what Adam did to what Abram did listening to their wives. Even the wording in the text is similar. Genesis 16:2 states, "And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." Genesis 3:17, God said to Adam, "Because you listened to the voice of your wife." Adam clearly knew what he was doing was inconsistent with God's instructions, so his was a deliberate act. Perhaps Abram's was not so much, given the points we've considered. Even so, there were consequences by way of contentious division in Abraham's immediate family and his lineage that has created mortal enemies of the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac to this very day. When Hagar, again the maidservant, fled because of Sarai's harsh treatment, an angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar and told her to return to submit to Sarai. And, as you know, the Lord proclaimed to Hagar that her offspring would be multiplied, so it could not be numbered. He also stated she would bear a son to be named Ishmael because the Lord listened to Hagar's affliction. And he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against every one, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all of his kinsmen. The name Ishmael means God hears, which speaks of the grace of God for anyone who will call out to him. The pronouncement concerning her child is that Ishmael will live a life of hostility toward others. Tradition holds that Arabs descend from Ishmael, the son of Abraham, but to better understand this requires study beyond what this class intends to bring. Genetically speaking, in light of the controversy about the term Arab throughout this time, I think more appropriate conclusion is that descendants of Ishmael are non-Jewish, period. However, since Ishmael is recognized by Muslims as the ancestor of several northern prominent Arab tribes as the forefather of Adnan, an ancestor of Muhammad, and they believe Muhammad was a descendant of Ishmael who would establish a great nation, I believe it is correct to say that Ishmael is the father of many Arabs, religiously speaking. Justin Hontz wrote, Adam's disobedience brought about the entire fall of mankind. Abram's was not quite as far-reaching. However, his first son, Ishmael, was the progenitor of the Arabs, and the Arabs have been a thorn in the side of the Jews for quite some time. Ishmael stayed true to the meaning of his name. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. Before I go further, let's make sure we acknowledge God's plan is that anyone who wants to be rightly related to God through faith in Jesus may do so. When we speak of people groups, we speak in generalities. As I stated in previous classes, being born of a particular lineage does not prevent a person from the opportunity to be redeemed by Christ and be restored unto God. It is the individual human will that makes the determination. 13 years after Ishmael was born, God again appears to Abram and says, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So, in all, and make careful note of this, for it's on the quiz, God came to Abram 4 times. First, to promise the land. Second, to promise numerous descendants. Third, expressing he and his descendants would be blessed. And fourth, that through him all the nations of the world would be blessed. Also, God repeatedly stated this covenant for God to be their God and for the land to be their land, a possession, is everlasting. In this, Abraham is as the first Adam by being a representative for all the nations, and again, this means nations of people. Then, in Genesis 17, verses 10 to 14, God introduces circumcision as his appointed sign of the covenant. Circumcision is not a Hebrew invention. For example, it was used in Egypt from the very early periods as an act of ritual purity. The nature of the sign suggests that it was intended to focus attention on the importance of Abraham's offspring, the royal line through which the blessings would come. This sign is not about establishing racial purity, since males who are not of Abraham's offspring are included, nor is it about social status, because no distinction is drawn between those born in Abraham's household and those bought with his money. However, every uncircumcised male shall be cut off from God's people. They were excluded from the benefits of belonging to the covenant. Circumcision distinguished those who believed in the importance of the divine promises to Abraham from those who did not. At this point, God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah. Both forms mean princess, and God made clear that the son of promise would indeed come from her womb. At this time, we learn Abram and Sarai laughed. I know it's popular to explain they laughed in disbelief, but it's equally probable that they experienced incredulous joy at this point in their faith walk, confident of God's miraculous working power. And from all of this, we learn God clearly favors the yet-to-be-born Isaac over Ishmael, although Ishmael too will become a great nation. Genesis 18-20 provides details of Abraham and Sarah's life and the continued tests of faith they would encounter. Then 25 years later, after the initial promise God made to them, Isaac is born, whose name means laughter. Genesis chapter 21-35 deals with the death of Sarah, the marriage of Isaac, Abraham's death, the birth and lives of Jacob and Esau, God's covenant with Jacob, and changing Jacob's name to Israel, and God telling Israel to be fruitful and multiply, that a nation of a company of nations shall come from him, and that kings shall come from Israel's own body. And God made clear the land he gave to Abraham and Isaac he will give to Israel and unto his offspring. Genesis 35, 9-12. In Genesis 35, we learn of the descendants of Esau, who were collectively referred to as the Edomites, and we learn of Jacob's son, Joseph, and how God orchestrated events to bring his people, the Israelites, to the place he predicted when he first spoke to Abram about their 400 years of captivity and their release when they will return to their land with abundant possessions. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 7-8 makes very clear God instructed his people to take possession of the promised land. The Pentateuch gives a moral rationale for the removal of the Canaanites, seeing it as a divine judgment for their iniquities. This action against these peoples then is an expression of God's judgment on them through his agency, Israel. This announces the moral nature of God to the whole world. The judgment is part of the blessings that Israel is to bring to the whole world. Israel's bringing judgment on the Canaanites foreshadows the great responsibility we have as followers of Jesus Christ. God's judgment allows no double standard. He did not base his choice of Israel on any merit of theirs, and he calls them to embrace his love faithfully. Unfaithfulness will lead to judgment upon Israel itself and all who choose to be rightly aligned with God through faith in Jesus Christ. God's provision include God's right to allocate land and judge the world with perfect justice, the need to protect the purity of the Israelite theocracy, and the way for even Canaanites to be saved, all illustrate the justice that lies behind God's provision. Deuteronomy 33 is part of your reading assignment for this class. This is before Moses' death, when he blesses the 12 tribes of Israel. You will note there is no mention of Simeon in the list of tribes, perhaps because the tribe was going to be dispersed. We see that in Genesis 49:7, and absorbed by Judah. Also, the 2 tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim are included in the tribe of Joseph. I ask you to use the link in the online quiz to study the map of the land where Abram sojourned in a comparison to the land of Israel that exists today. The book of Joshua recounts the Israelites' conquest of the land of Canaan under the command of Joshua. The book opens with Shittim, with Joshua's commission for the Lord as a leader of the Israelites, progresses through his victories over the Canaanite kings and the allotment of the land, and ends with Joshua's charge to the people to remain faithful to the land. So here we have a biblical account of the people and the land God has given to his people, Israel, with the history of the nation through and after Abraham. Considering current world events in the Middle East and the conflict between the people in that region, this is a very important matter for the people of the world to know. Perhaps just the information from this class will cause people to choose to be rightly aligned with God, to join the family of the father of Abraham, and to be grafted in to the people of God. Certainly, geographical nations of the world change by way of conquest, natural disasters, land purchases, and other causes. However, it is my conclusion that the specific land that God identified belonging to the Israelites is, as God said, theirs forever. I contend that we who have been grafted in or adopted into the people of God, the family of God, should be just as inclined to protect what God has given to those who actually live in the land, to his people, the Israelites, the Jews. In this way, we will bless them, and in turn, God will bless us. May we solemnly, all of us, understand the promise that God will bless those who bless Abraham and his offspring, and curse those who dishonor or curses Abraham and his offspring. This promise stands today. Israel is both a nation of people joined by faith and a geopolitical nation as part of God's efforts to ultimately make all of the earth as the Garden of Eden. Next week, we'll consider the history of the geopolitical nations of modern-day Israel and the United States.